Honestly, sweetheart, you should be grateful we let you sit at the adult table at all. That was my stepmother's idea of a toast. She lifted her champagne flute, and the whole anniversary dinner laughed. And I sat there, at the far end of the rented banquet hall, holding the envelope my grandmother had pressed into my hand 20 minutes earlier, before the speeches started. Before the catering staff began circling with their little trays of seared scallops, inside the envelope was a deed, not a copy. The original deed to the lake house in northern Michigan. The one with the screened porch where I'd spent every summer of my childhood. The one nobody in the family had been allowed to visit in almost 6 years because my father said Grandma had let it fall apart. My grandmother had folded my fingers around it and whispered, "It's yours now. Don't let them tell you otherwise." Then she'd straightened up, smiled at the room like nothing had happened, and let my aunt wheel her back to the head table. I should explain who I am, because it matters for the rest of this. My name is Delphine, though everyone in my family has called me Del since I was 4 years old, usually in a tone that suggested I was a small disappointment that had wandered in from outside. I'm 31. I work as a title examiner for a real estate firm in Grand Rapids, which is a fancy way of saying I read property records all day. I trace ownership back through decades of deeds and liens and easements and figure out whether a piece of land actually belongs to the person trying to sell it. It is, by every measure my family has ever used, the most boring job a human being can have. My stepmother once introduced me at a party as the one who does paperwork. My half-brother called it professional reading. Nobody in that room knew what I actually did for a living, and that turned out to be the most expensive mistake they ever made. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The dinner was for my father and stepmother's 15th wedding anniversary. They'd rented a hall, hired a string quartet, the whole production. My father, whom I'll just call my dad because I never figured out a warmer word for him, had married my stepmother when I was 16, 2 years after my own mother died. My stepmother came with a son a year older than me, my stepbrother, and from the very first week, it was clear how the math of the household was going to work. There was a column for them and a column for me, and the columns never balanced. When my stepbrother wanted to go to a private university in Boston, the money appeared. When I asked about help with community college, my dad gave me a speech about self-reliance and the dignity of paying your own way. When my stepbrother's first marriage fell apart and he needed somewhere to land, they bought him a condo. As an investment, you understand, it's really an investment. When my car died in the middle of a January ice storm and I asked to borrow $800 to fix the transmission, my stepmother told me, very gently, that learning to budget was a skill that would serve me well and that they couldn't keep rescuing me. I was 26. I had never once been rescued. So I did what I always did. I fixed the car myself over 3 weekends in a friend's heated garage, watching videos on my phone with my hands so cold I could barely feel the wrench. I ate a lot of rice and beans that winter. I told myself that someday it wouldn't be like this, without ever quite believing it. The thing you have to understand is that I never thought the lake house was mine to want. In my family, the lake house was Grandma's, and Grandma's things flowed downhill toward my dad and my stepbrother, the way water always did. So when she handed me that deed at the anniversary dinner, my first feeling wasn't joy, it was fear. Because I knew, the way you know a storm is coming from the color of the sky, that the moment anyone found out, they would take it. Have you ever held something in your hands that you knew would be ripped away from you the second you let it show? Tell me in the comments, because I need to know I'm not the only one. I didn't tell anyone that night. I drove home with the envelope tucked into my coat against my chest, and I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning, reading that deed the way other people read love letters. And here's where the boring job comes in, because I read it like a title examiner, not like a granddaughter. I checked the legal description against the plat I pulled up on my laptop. I checked the recording stamp. I checked the chain of title, and something was wrong. The deed in my hand was real. It was properly executed, notarized, dated 11 years ago. My grandmother had quietly deeded the lake house to me when I was 20, with a clause that the transfer wouldn't be recorded until she chose to deliver it. But when I searched the county records online, the property wasn't listed under my name, and it wasn't listed under my grandmother's name either. According to the public record, the lake house had been sold 4 years ago to a limited liability company called Northwater Holdings. I sat very still. Outside, a plow scraped down my street. A property cannot be sold by someone who doesn't own it. My grandmother had deeded that house to me 11 years ago. If that deed was valid, then everything that happened to the property after that point, including a sale to some LLC, was built on a foundation that didn't exist. You can't sell what isn't yours. I read property records all day. I knew exactly what I was looking at, and what I was looking at was somebody's fraud. I didn't sleep. I made coffee at 5 and kept working. Northwater Holdings, it turned out, had been formed in Michigan 4 years and 2 months ago. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize. Some attorney in Traverse City. But the LLC's annual report listed its sole member, and the sole member was a name I knew very well. It was my stepbrother. The pieces started arranging themselves, and the picture they made was ugly. My grandmother had been moved into assisted living about 4.5 years ago after a fall. Around that same time, my dad and my stepmother had taken over what they called managing her affairs. I remembered the family meeting where they'd announced it, the careful language about how Grandma wasn't herself anymore and needed people who could make sound decisions on her behalf. I remembered my stepmother saying it was such a burden, but family steps up. I remembered believing her. What they had done, as far as I could reconstruct it, was use a power of attorney to sell the lake house out from under my grandmother to an LLC owned by my stepbrother for a price that the deed listed as $10 and other good and valuable consideration. $10. They had transferred a lakefront property worth somewhere north of $600,000 to my stepbrother for $10, and then, I would later learn, taken out a mortgage against it to fund the kitchen renovation, 2 cruises, and the down payment on a boat. The only problem with their plan, the one fatal flaw, was that the lake house had never belonged to my grandmother to begin with. Not for the last 11 years. It had belonged to me. They had sold a house that wasn't theirs to sell, using a power of attorney over a woman who no longer legally owned it. Every signature, every filing, every dollar of that mortgage was sitting on top of a fraud, and they had no idea. My first instinct was to call my dad and scream at him. I actually picked up the phone. Then I put it back down, because something my grandmother used to say floated up in my mind. She used to tell me, when I was small and furious about some injustice my stepbrother had gotten away with, "Don't show your hand to people who are still dealing the cards, baby. Wait until the game is yours." I drove up to the assisted living facility that weekend. 3 hours north, the highway turning to slush, and then to clean white snow as I got into the real winter country. My grandmother was sitting by the window in a cardigan I'd given her years ago, and when she saw me, her whole face changed. We were not supposed to be able to have a real conversation, according to my dad. She was confused now, he'd said. It's sad, but she doesn't really track things anymore. She tracked things just fine. You found it, she said before I'd even sat down. Not a question. I found a lot of things, Grandma. She told me everything. How my dad and stepmother had pressured her to sign the power of attorney while she was still groggy from her hip surgery, telling her it was just for paying bills. How they'd stopped bringing her mail. How my stepbrother had visited exactly once in 4 years and only to have her sign something she couldn't read because they'd taken her good glasses for safekeeping. How she'd suspected they were doing something with the house but couldn't prove it. Couldn't even get a phone call out half the time. And how the one thing she'd held on to, the one card she'd kept hidden, was that old deed. She'd given it to her hairdresser to hold, of all people, a woman who came to the facility every 3 weeks because she didn't trust anyone in the family not to search her room. "I knew you'd understand it," she said, and reached over and tapped the back of my hand with one papery finger. The others would have just framed it and hung it on a wall. You'd read it. I cried a little in the parking lot before I drove home. Then I stopped crying and started planning. Here is what most people get wrong about a situation like this. They think the move is to confront, to storm in with the truth and watch the guilty faces crumble. But truth without proof is just an accusation, and an accusation against people who control your grandmother's care, who have lawyers and money and a 15-year head start on the family narrative, is a good way to get yourself painted as the unstable one. They'd already laid the groundwork, the greedy one, the one who does paperwork and resents everyone who does better. I'd heard the way my stepmother could turn a story. I wasn't going to hand her one, so I did it the boring way, the title examiner way. Over the next 6 weeks, I built a file. I ordered certified copies of every recorded document related to the property going back 20 years. I had my 11-year-old deed verified by a forensic document examiner who confirmed the notary's seal was authentic and the signatures legitimate and the ink consistent with the date. I pulled the LLC's formation documents and its mortgage filing. I tracked down the notary who'd supposedly witnessed my grandmother signing the sale to Northwater Holdings and discovered the notary's commission had actually expired 2 months before the date on the document, which meant the notarization itself was void. They hadn't even been careful. Why would they be? Nobody in the family read paperwork. Nobody but the one who does paperwork. And then I found the thing that turned a civil case into something my stepbrother couldn't laugh his way out of. The mortgage application he'd filed to borrow against the house contained a sworn statement, signed by him, attesting that he was the lawful owner of the property and that there were no competing claims to title. That's a federal form on a federally regulated loan. Lying on it isn't a family squabble, it's bank fraud. I quietly retained an attorney, a sharp, unsmiling woman in Lansing who specialized in elder financial abuse, and I paid her with the savings I'd scraped together over years of being told to learn the value of $1. When she finished reviewing my file, she set it down on her desk, looked at me over her reading glasses, and said, "Dell, this isn't a case. This is a confession with a bow on it. They did all the work for us. We didn't move fast. We moved correctly." We had my grandmother evaluated by an independent geriatric specialist who found her entirely competent, which by itself blew a hole in 4 years of my dad's story about her being not herself. We filed to revoke the power of attorney. We prepared a quiet title action to establish, on the public record, that the lake house had been mine since I was 20, and then my attorney suggested we let them come to us. The opportunity arrived faster than I expected. My stepbrother, it turned out, had been trying to actually sell the lake house to a real buyer this time, to cash out before the boat payment swallowed him. A buyer's title company had ordered an examination, and a title examiner somewhere, a stranger doing my exact job, had flagged a problem in the chain of title that they couldn't resolve. The sale stalled. My stepbrother started making angry phone calls, and my dad, who must have started to feel the ground shifting, called a family meeting to clear up some confusion about Grandma's estate. He held it at his house in the formal dining room they only used for performances. My stepmother had laid out a cheese board. There's something I'll never forget about walking into that room. How sure of themselves they all were. My dad at the head of the table. My stepmother to his right, reapplying the warm, patient expression she used whenever she was about to explain to me why I was wrong. My stepbrother lounging like he owned the place, which, in his mind, he sort of did. They'd invited me, I realized, because they wanted me to sign something. A document, my dad said, just acknowledging the family's understanding of how Grandma's property had been handled, so we can all move forward. They wanted my signature to paper over the fraud. I sat at the end of the table, the same end I always sat at, and I let my dad talk. He talked for a long time. About family. About how Grandma's affairs had been such a burden. About how he and my stepmother had made hard choices to preserve the family's assets. About how the lake house had been dealt with appropriately, and how it was time for everyone to stop dwelling on the past. When he finally slid the paper across the table toward me, my stepmother smiled and said, "We know paperwork is your little thing, Dell. We figured you'd appreciate doing it properly." I looked at the paper. Then I looked at my stepbrother. "Before I sign anything," I said, "I want to make sure I understand the ownership, just so it's proper. Who owns the lake house right now?" My stepbrother smirked. I do. Bought it from Grandma 4 years ago. It's all recorded, if you'd bother to look. Bought it for how much? He waved a hand. Fair market. It's documented. It's documented as $10, I said. The room got quiet in that particular way. I reached into my bag and took out a folder. Not the whole file. Just enough. I'd learned that from watching them my whole life. You don't have to show everyone everything. You just have to show them the one thing that ends the conversation. I laid the first page down. This is a deed. My grandmother executed it 11 years ago. It transfers the lake house to me. It's notarized, it's verified by a forensic examiner, and it predates your purchase by 7 years. I laid down the second page. Which is a problem because Grandma couldn't sell you a house she didn't own anymore. She'd already given it to me. Third page. This is the notarization on your purchase. The notary's commission expired 2 months before the date here. The sale's void on its face. Fourth page, and I slid this one all the way down to my stepbrother. And this is the mortgage application where you swore, under penalty of perjury, on a federal loan document that you were the lawful owner with no competing claims. That one's not a family matter. That one's a crime. Nobody said anything. The string quartet from the anniversary, the warm laughter, all of it felt like it had happened to a different person. My dad's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. My stepmother opened her mouth, and for the first time in 15 years, nothing came out. My stepbrother lunged for the pages, and I slid them back into my bag. Those are copies, I said. My attorney has the originals. So does the county. So, as of this morning, does the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Michigan. Dell, my dad said, and his voice cracked on the one syllable. Dell, we're family. We can work this out as a family. I thought about the transmission I'd fixed with frozen hands. I thought about the rice and beans. I thought about my grandmother's good glasses, taken for safekeeping, so she couldn't read the papers they put in front of her. You spent 4 years telling everyone Grandma wasn't herself, I said. She's been more herself than any of you this whole time. She's the one who saw what you were. She just needed someone who could read the proof. My stepmother found her voice then, and it came out the way I'd always known it would when it finally dropped the warmth. After everything we did for you, you never did anything for me, I said. You did things to me and called it generosity. There's a difference. I've spent my whole life reading the difference between what a document says and what it actually does. You just never thought I was worth being careful around. I stood up. I left the cheese board untouched. The rest of it took the better part of a year, and the law moved the way the law moves, slowly and then all at once. The quiet title action restored the lake house to my name. It had been mine the whole time, on paper, where it counted. The mortgage my stepbrother had taken out was his problem to repay, since it was secured against a property he'd never legally owned, and the bank, once it understood the application had been fraudulent, was not gentle about it. My dad and stepmother were named in the elder abuse complaint for what they'd done to my grandmother under that power of attorney. My stepbrother was charged federally for the loan fraud. He did not go to a private university's worth of prison, but he did not walk away clean either. And the condo that had been an investment, you understand, went toward restitution. My grandmother moved out of the facility my dad had stashed her in. She lives at the lake house now, in the summers, with a caregiver she chose herself and likes. And in the winters, she stays with me in Grand Rapids, where she has reclaimed an alarming amount of the kitchen. We screened in the porch again. We fixed the dock. The first morning we had coffee out there together, the lake flat and silver and the loons calling. She patted the back of my hand the way she does and said, I always knew the boring one would turn out to be the dangerous one. I told her I do not do anything dangerous. I read paperwork. She laughed at that, the real laugh, the one I hadn't heard in years. That's exactly what I mean, she said. My stepmother sent me a letter a few months ago. A long one, full of the word family, full of the word forgiveness. asking whether we couldn't all move past this for everyone's sake. I read it the way I read everything now, carefully, all the way to the end, looking for what it actually said underneath what it claimed to say. And what it actually said was, "Please make this go away before it costs us anything more." I filed it in a drawer and I went back to work. For a long time after it was over, I kept coming back to one small thing: my grandmother giving her deed to her hairdresser, a woman she saw every 3 weeks, someone outside the whole rotten family system, because she trusted a near stranger more than the people who were supposed to love her. That detail still sits in my chest. It tells you everything about what my dad and my stepmother and my stepbrother had built. They didn't just take a house. They made an old woman feel she had no one safe inside her own bloodline. The thing I understand now that I didn't understand at 26, fixing my transmission with frozen hands, is that none of what happened to my family was random. It wasn't bad luck, and it wasn't fate. My stepbrother got charged because he signed his name to a lie on a federal form, and a signature is a choice. My dad and stepmother lost the narrative they'd controlled for 15 years because they built that narrative on the assumption that no one would ever check their work. Every outcome had a cause, and the causes were all the small, daily decisions they made when they thought no one who mattered was watching. They were watching me, too. They just decided I didn't matter. That decision cost them the lake house, the condo, and a good deal more. What saved my grandmother in the end wasn't anger, and I want to be honest about that, because I had plenty of anger, and it never once moved a document. What moved the documents was 3 things: working together. The first was simply refusing to sign my name to something I knew was false, even when family and forgiveness were the words being waved in my face. That's not nothing. Plenty of people sign just to make the room comfortable again. The second was the patience to read, to verify, to build a file slowly when every instinct screamed to confront. Truth without proof is just noise, and I had spent my whole life being told my reading was a small and boring thing. It turned out to be the sharpest tool in the house. And the third was the sheer stubbornness to keep going through 6 weeks of certified copies and forensic examiners and an attorney I'd paid for with the savings I'd built. Dollar by careful dollar, the very value of a dollar my dad once lectured me about. So if you take anything from what I've told you, let it be this: be the kind of person who won't put their name on a lie, no matter how warmly the lie is offered. Learn to read the difference between what something claims to be and what it actually does, because most people never bother, and the ones who don't bother are the ones who get robbed. And when you're tired, when the proof is buried 3 counties deep and nobody believes you, keep going anyway. They called me the boring one for 31 years. Boring is just patient, and patient, it turns out, is dangerous. The loons are calling on the lake this morning. My grandmother is in the kitchen, rearranging things that were fine where they were. I wouldn't trade it for anything.